This is Johnny Dosco. Stay tuned for another Score Sheet podcast. Holy Kadelka!
Hello, and welcome to another Score Sheet podcast. Today we have with us Geoff Young. Jeff is, among other things, he started Duck Snorts, which was a blog about all things Padres. He's written for Baseball Digest, the Hardball Times, Baseball Prospectus, and now he's got a kind of a blog going with a few other people called Padres Public. He's also, maybe most important, played Score Sheet for over 20 years. How are you, Jeff?
I'm doing great. How about yourself?
I am excellent, thanks. This has been one of the most active hot stove leagues I can remember.
Oh yeah, it's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, lots of player movement. Of course, Padres are your main focus. Have they made moves that you're either happy or unhappy with so far this year?
I mean, they've done a lot of little tuning up here and there, adding guys around the edges, and then I guess probably the biggest things they've done were signing Josh Johnson, who obviously is coming off a horrible year, but there's some potential upside there. I'm not ecstatic about that pickup, but on the other hand, it's a one-year deal, so there's not a whole lot of risk involved. And then the other two big things they did were traded Luke Gregerson to Oakland for Seth Smith, which is a slight downgrade in talent probably, but a little bit better fit for the Padres, who were forced to play guys like Mark Kotze and Alexi Amarista in the outfield last year. And then they've agreed to terms with Joaquin Benoit to fill Gregerson's slot. So yeah, I mean, I think I'm pretty pleased with the way they're going right now.
Well, speaking of Josh Johnson, I mean, isn't it true somewhat that just like having a hitter on your fantasy team that gets traded to Colorado is cause for celebration, that having a pitcher on your fantasy team suddenly get to pitch at Petco is also a kind of a boon?
Yeah, in theory that should help him. It's just hard to say coming off of the year he had. How healthy he is and how able he is to establish his fastball command and that sort of thing. Plus the fences are a little bit different than they were a few years ago, so it's a little bit less friendly. I mean, you can't just go out there and serve up everything like Clayton Richard, I suppose, last year before he got hurt. It's a little bit less forgiving than it used to be, but still, I think it's probably not the worst thing to happen to your pitcher if he gets traded over there.
But it's not quite as good as 4 years ago when everybody pretty much considered Petco the best pitcher's park in the majors.
Yeah, I'd say it's probably gone from like awesome for your pitcher to just pretty good.
Huh. Well, at least it's a step in the right direction. I mean, guys like Johnson, obviously no one's going to make spend a really high draft pick on him, but he's a guy that has certainly shown flashes of great potential, so he could work out well.
Yeah, I mean, the Padres have a couple of guys like that have had success in the past. Between him and Ian Kennedy, who they acquired late last season, you got a couple of guys that they might not be bad score sheet flyers.
Yeah. Well, and then sticking to the West Coast, because I know you pretty much follow the West Coast entirely. The A's, and Billy Beane seems to have once again, without really spending money, improved the A's.
Well, we talked about the Smith for Gregerson deal, and so he went out and picked up Gregerson, and he went and picked up Jim Johnson from the Orioles for not a lot, and that's two really nice guys to add to what was already a pretty strong bullpen. And then of course moving Brad Anderson to the Rockies. Speaking of guys who are going to take a possible hit in value, and picking up Drew Pomeranz, who really hasn't been able to put it together for the Rockies, but still has a pretty good arm. So
yeah, that's a guy that I actually, not that I'm an expert on sleepers by any means, but when I saw Pomeranz is going from Colorado to Oakland, I circled his name on my draft list and thought, okay, this is a guy that certainly qualifies as a post-hype kind of sleeper guy. He's got a ton of hype, went to Colorado, did nothing, and now he's going to a team that everything Billy Beane touches seems to turn to gold. Plus, Oakland is, much like San Diego, a really good pitcher's park.
Yeah, I mean, that was kind of a classic Beane move. It's sort of like when he got Jared Parker from the Diamondbacks. Although I think Parker had a little bit better track record at the time, but for sure Pomeranz was hugely hyped not long ago, and he's still very young, so that could certainly work out for the A's.
Yeah, well, the A's also, I mean, this applies to score sheet owners also. Billy Beane, when he makes a trade, seems to make it with a plan in mind. He's addressing needs on his team, and/or he really sees a guy that he thinks is going to blossom. For instance, the Gregerson for Smith trade, the A's really didn't need Seth Smith, and any team could use a Gregerson. So talent-wise, I'm not sure it was, that unbalanced, but I think it helped the A's quite a bit.
Oh yeah, definitely. I actually think that one probably helped both teams. It may slightly favor the A's, but that was a classic example of need for need, and it's kind of a no-brainer.
Yeah, no, it seemed like, I mean, that's what I try to do if I'm going to propose trades in one of my score sheet leagues. The place I start is I look for a team that needs help at a position I have extra players at, and Bean seems to understand that, and he finds trading partners that he feels he can make a deal that might help both teams, but certainly help his team.
Oh, absolutely. And actually, another thing, if you're talking about the A's and score sheet, one thing that's kind of worth noting is that Bob Melvin does a really good job of platooning his players and getting the most out of them that way, so that you're not, like, for example, when Smith was over there, he wasn't getting a lot of at-bats against left-handers who completely destroy him. So that's something that's kind of good to keep in mind when you're drafting or looking to acquire players for your score sheet teams. You're not going to get guys that are being used improperly, where that might happen somewhere else.
There's something to be said for drafting players on your fantasy team, your score sheet team, that are in organizations that do a good job of putting those players in a position to succeed.
Yeah, they understand how to use them, exactly.
Yeah. Trading is, of course, especially this time of year, most score sheet players are now in keeper or continuing leagues. I think it's probably 2/3 of our score sheet teams are in a league that keeps players. So all of those teams, of course, you can trade in the off season. And, I think coming up with a good trading philosophy is just as important as a good drafting philosophy.
Absolutely, and I think, again, Bean is a really good model to look after. Actually, if you just look at what's going on in any Major League Baseball organization, for myself, when I'm looking at trades, I'm always asked, my first question, even before what do I need, is how can I help someone? What void can I fill? So I look at other teams' rosters and I say, all right, they're weak at shortstop, they're weak at, pitcher, or they could use some help here. And I look at that and say, all right, where do I have a surplus? And then I start looking and saying, all right, I'll maybe identify 3 to 5 guys on their team that I want to go for, and maybe have different tiers of, okay, here's who I'm going to ask for, here's who I'm going to settle for, and so on like that. But I'm always trying to think, my first thought is always, how can I help this other person? And if I go into it with that frame of mind, I find, for one thing, it's more enjoyable, and for another, because you end up having fun conversations as part of the trading process, the negotiation process, and for another, I find that the more I can help someone else meet their needs, it comes back, the more that they can help me meet mine. So it seems to be a win-win situation.
Yeah, because if you're in a continuing league, ideally you're going to play in it for many years, and if you get a reputation in a league of being a guy that is always out there trying to fleece the other owners, pretty soon nobody really wants to trade with you. And I know there are owners in some of my leagues that I've made a couple trades with that kind of backfired, and I thought, that should have just never made that in the first place, and now I just really don't trade with those guys anymore.
Yeah, it does come back after. I mean, the leagues I play in, I've been playing in since the mid '90s, and by and large we know each other pretty well. And yeah, because when you've only got a certain number of people you can trade with, it does limit your options. So you want to keep as many of those channels open as possible.
Yeah, I agree. One other thing I was thinking about trades, though, is I think the Tampa Bay Rays are a great organization to emulate, but all this talk of them trading David Price reminds me that score sheet trading is a little different than Major League trading. In general, I really think it's a big mistake to trade a guy in his prime for prospects. Tampa Bay's doing it for reasons that don't apply to score sheet. He's going to be a free agent after 2015. They feel they're not going to have the money to pay him. They think they can get a lot more in return for a trade now when he has 2 years left rather than waiting a year and just having 1 year left. But I don't think that means at all that if you own David Price in a score sheet league, you'd be smart to trade him for, I don't care how many prospects almost.
Well, yeah, I mean, we had that in San Diego with Adrian Gonzalez a couple of years ago, and from a financial standpoint, the windfall that he was scheduled to make and ended up making, it made all the sense in the world business-wise for the Padres to deal him for prospects. But yeah, in score sheet, I mean, he's not quite the player he was at that time, but there was no reason to be trading him for Casey Kelly and Anthony Rizzo. So
no, I mean, I do think on the flip side, Bill Walsh used to be famous around the Bay Area for saying that he'd rather trade a player 1 year too early than 1 year too late. And so I understand that theory, but I do in score sheet. I see guys that are 27, 28, 29 years old getting traded for prospects in hopes that the prospect might someday be as good as the guy they're trading away. And to me, since we don't have that financial consideration in score sheet, those kind of trades really don't make any sense at all.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with that.
Well, maybe moving on to real baseball for a second. Do you think the Padres can contend with the Dodgers and their $300 million payroll?
I think probably the biggest thing they have going in their favor is that there's no way the Dodgers can play like they did the last 4 months of last season again. No team does that. Of course, they still have that great pitching, so that's going to be tough to overcome. But yeah, I mean, I don't see why the Padres can't be as competitive as anybody else in that division, with the possible exception of the Dodgers and their giant payroll. But I don't think the Padres are done making moves yet necessarily, but I look at what they've got right now and what they did last year, and I look at it, I see, well, that's a 500 team, and if you're a 500 team, and you swing that 5 to 10 games either way, I'm not going to say they're going to be a contender, but I don't think we can write them off either.
That's one thing that's nice about sports, fantasy and real sports, is that teams, they move a lot in the standings. I mean, if at the end of a year you go back and you look at the March predictions from all the writers and websites around the world, who's going to come in first, who's going to come in last, generally come October, those predictions are not really worth the paper they're written on.
Oh, no, they're hilarious. I think I had the Blue Jays winning it all last year.
You and 500,000 other people, yeah.
Yeah, and the unpredictability is what makes it fun to watch. The classic example would be, I mean, this is really going back a ways, but you look at somebody like the 60 Pirates or the 69 Mets. These are teams that just came out of nowhere, and people are still talking about those teams 40, 50 years later.
You have to be a little realistic as a fantasy owner. You can't be trading for 36-year-old first baseman if your team is clearly a lower division, lower half of the league team. You need to maybe punt a year, trade for some young guys. But that said, I think you can rebuild almost any team in a year or two. It's not a 10-year project. It's a couple years at most, I think, if you do a good job. Well, Geoff, it's been great talking to you. Hopefully we will do this again in a few weeks, and hopefully your score sheet teams will exhibit success this year.
I'm very much in favor of that.
Yeah, well, you usually do really well, so that's a pretty safe bet on my part. Thanks for being on, and we'll talk to you soon.
All right, take care.